but it's also clear she had more in mind. The NAACP was at that meeting because they thought, perfect, this will become part of our NAACP youth branch. The SCLC was there because they thought, perfect, this will become the SCLC youth branch. And it's clear now that Ella went around in the days before their meetings, talking to people and saying to them, you know what, maybe students have something distinctive to contribute themselves. Maybe you should retain your own independence. Out of that organization came the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC would be the spearhead of the movement in Mississippi, and the spearhead of what I truly think is one of the most remarkable experiments in grassroots democracy in our nation's history. This I just wanted to show you because it's such a compelling picture. The sit-ins came very late in Mississippi, and were very few, partly because the risks of violence were much higher. But this is the first sit-in in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963 at the Jackson War. These are people from Tougaloo College. Interestingly enough, two of them are white. This is John Salter, a young professor there. Joan Trumpauer, a young white Mississippian who had chosen to go to Tougaloo College. And Ann Moody, a black student there in Canton, I believe. What's that? Woodville, who is the author of one of the extraordinary memoirs of the period called Coming of Age in Mississippi. This went on for hours. What you see all over John Salter is blood. He's routinely being beaten by people with brass knuckles. Over 100 policemen were present, doing nothing. 9 FBI agents stood outside taking notes on the grounds that they had no jurisdiction. So it's just a glimpse of what we're talking about here. This is another name I think you'll hear a lot of next year. This is Robert Parrish, simply Bob Moses. He would become the chief field secretary of SNCC. We'll read part of his book. Spent a lot of his time in Macomb. Extraordinary figure, very soft-spoken, modest to the point of complete self-effacement. But precisely for that reason, somebody who epitomized the vision of SNCC as a kind of group-centered democratic organization. He was a graduate student in mathematics and philosophy from New York, and had begun to work, I think in Atlanta, with SCLC, and found him as much out of step with it as Ella Baker. So what Ella did was said, you know, we need more students to come to the second SNCC conference. We didn't have anybody from Mississippi. So why don't you go and find some? And here are some names of people I know from the years she had spent in the 30s and 40s organizing. That's one. That's Medgar Evers. There he is, coming back as a returning serviceman. The first thing he did was he went and registered to vote. And did then get registered. When he went to actually vote, was greeted by armed white men. This is another man you probably haven't heard of, from Cleveland, Ohio, named Amzie Moore. And this was the person that Bob Moses went to see at Ella Baker's recommendation. And that conversation would really change the meaning of the movement in Mississippi. Amzie had been doing organizing work around voting registration since he got back from the war. And these were tough men. There were a lot of powerful women in this movement, but there were also some men who had survived in the briar patch for a long time. This was a guy, he ran a gas station and cafe. And he refused to segregate his bathroom. Refused to put up the Jim Crow signs. He even started distributing bumper stickers that said, "Don't shop where you can't use the restroom." We're talking about the late 1940s, early 1950s in the heart of the Delta. He used to stay up nights. I don't get to visit his house. Floodlights surrounded his house, and many nights he would simply sleep by the window with his rifle. Well, Bob Moses goes to see Amzie Moore, and Amzie says, so look, you know, all the stuff you're saying about, I admire the sit-ins, this is all great, but you know what? That's not where I'm at. What's important here is voter registration. You know what? You can sit in, you can work at a lunch counter, sit at a lunch counter or not. But as long as the sheriff, the justice of the peace, the agricultural extension officer, the judge, the county board of supervisors, as long as every one of those guys is a white man in the pockets of the planters, we're getting nowhere. We're looking at counties in which black people are often majorities, in some cases more than 2/3 of the population. What we need to do is voter registration. Bob Moses would later remark that he was shocked to hear that he had never before really thought about the fact, as he said, he'd grown up reading about the Iron Curtain, where people couldn't vote. It only then occurred to him that there was a cotton curtain behind which people were also deprived of the right to vote. SNCC began to get involved in voter registration work. Some in Mississippi, particularly some of the people in SNCC, were uneasy with that decision. Direct action, sitting in, the freedom rides, risking your life. That was dramatic. That was adrenaline. That was laying your body on the line, the kind of thing that appealed to young people. Voting? That's what old people did. I mean, these kids are 18, 19, 20 years old. They can't vote anywhere. Why would we want to do that? That's the system. That's not what we're into. We're about changing the system. Ultimately, after vociferous debates within SNCC, they decide to actually allow two different branches. And one branch of SNCC will continue to do voter registration work, slow, patient work. Going into communities, working with local people, talking to them, trying to identify local leaders, and trying to find people with the courage to take their lives in their hands and walk down to the county courthouse and try to cast a ballot. Register so they can cast a ballot. At the same time, to maintain a direct action wing. Although in Mississippi, the really formative work would be that community organizing work that took place through voter registration. As it happened, Amzie, so Bob Moses went back, reflected on that, talked to Ella Baker, decided to proceed. And somehow word leaked to the press. And there was a article in Jet Magazine, Black Magazine, about plans for a voter registration campaign in Mississippi, identifying Amzie as the person running it. And Amzie knew at that point, so when Bob Moses came back, he knew he wasn't ready. That they didn't have the resources yet to begin this, and that there was, in all likelihood, people would get killed. But he got a letter from a Pullman porter in Macomb, Mississippi, named C.C. Bryant, who was also an NAACP member, also a tough as a hickory knot. We read about this in Jet and said, hey, why don't you send one of these voter registration guys to me? And so Amzie sent Bob Moses to Macomb, Mississippi. And the movement that they built here is one that we'll continue to talk about over the coming year, and one that I hope your students might also have occasion to learn about. That's what I've got. Thank you.
Mississippians from all walks of life, all stations of life, top, bottom, and middle. We have everything from humble farmers and sharecroppers and tenant farmers to most of the governors since World War II, interviews, and everybody in between. And what we do is act as the major repository for narratives about the history of Mississippi. So we, our staff, our research associates, and partners, independent researchers that we team up with, all kinds of folks, will go out and interview people about their experiences and about their lives to get their stories. And then we save those and make them available to folks like you, to researchers, to anybody that's interested in learning about the state. So that's what we do. Our collections are broad and deep. We have about 4,000 interviews, just under 4,000. The most important areas of our collections relate to the history of Mississippi politics and the history of the Civil Rights Movement. And the origin, preserving the history of the movement, I should say, was a major reason why the Center for Oral History first began in the early 1970s. Colleagues of mine who all retired, and of course I was in grade school then, but who looked around and saw that, in 1971 and 72, that this convulsive and heroic change had happened in Mississippi, that you had this remarkable social movement that was tied together by activists and all kinds of people, and that we wouldn't really know much about this for future generations unless we sat down and started talking to people about their lives. My senior colleague Neil McMillan was instrumental in this, a very eminent historian of the Civil Rights Movement. And those of you that went to Southern may have had a class with him. He's now retired, fishing in Michigan, I think. Well, let me get my machine started here, and before I get started with that, I'd like to know a little bit about y'all. I'll tell you about myself. You can tell from my thick Mississippi accent that I come from a long, distinguished line of Mississippians. I'm actually from up north originally, born in New York City, and raised there and in North Carolina. I consider North Carolina to be my home. That's where all my family, extended family is. And I've been in Mississippi for 15 years, teaching at Southern. Came here by way of the University of North Carolina and Vanderbilt University, where I did my graduate work. I'm a specialist in the history of the South, so I've published a great deal on aspects of Southern history, everything ranging from how the South managed to experience urbanization, what made urbanization happen, to the demography of the internal slave trade, to, yes, I did publish an essay on Southerners in professional wrestling, reprinted 5 times. So, go figure. That was something I did on a lark, and that's the one that gets read the most. Jerry Lawler just had a heart attack. The King, that's right. Yeah, you remember the old USA Wrestling out of Memphis. So we got some fans. So that's what I do. Publish some books and those other kinds of things that academics tend to do. I don't know if anyone's actually ever read the books, but I certainly have written them and published them. So, but I want to get a sense for what you guys. How many here are high school history teachers, teaching at the high school level? Okay. So, and anybody at the middle school? Okay, so that's good. And anybody here with the elementary grades? Okay. Yeah. The oral history is a technique for learning about the past, for gathering stories, learning about people's experiences. That really, I mean, if you can speak, if you're old enough to use language, it can be used by any age student. Now, of course, you have to be appropriate to each age. Elementary grades will do one thing, middle school and high school will do another. But it really is something that's open to everybody in the classroom. And it's a great classroom technique that's inexpensive. It doesn't require fancy